And I received a phone call from my wife back in Jerusalem, who told me that one of her first cousins, Sasson Noriel, disappeared. My wife is from an Iraqi family. To put this in perspective, she has 36 first cousins, I have 2. Sasson was her age. She grew up with him in Netanya. He worked in a factory outside of Jerusalem in the Mishur Adumim industrial zone. In order to support his family, he would, in his free time, buy and sell equipment from Palestinians, from restaurants and factories, and sell them in Israel. He was fluent in Arabic and had a lot of Palestinian friends. And one day after work, he was enticed to go and see what was presented to him as a factory that had closed down, and the equipment was for sale. Sasson went to Ramallah and didn't come home. Knowing of all my contacts in Palestine, of all my connections with Palestinians, the family asked me to try and help find out what happened to Sasson. My wife called me. I made phone calls back home. I called my Palestinian co-director, Mr. Hannah Senora, and I asked Hannah if he would go to Ramallah to ask around. He did. He went to the Ramallah police. He went to other security installations of the Palestinian Authority. He asked around town. No one had heard anything about Sasson. 6 days later, the Hamas issued a video on one of their websites. Sasson was blindfolded. He was handcuffed. His face was full of blood. The Hamas combatants who were holding him demanded that Israel release Palestinian prisoners from jail. 3 days later, the Israeli Shin Bet found his body. He was butchered with a butcher's knife. The person who killed him, with his bare hands, killed him. It wasn't a bus bombing, it wasn't a suicide bombing. Someone killed him with a knife. I couldn't do anything to help Sasson. He had traveled back with me in our car from a wedding a month before. We were talking about peace, we were talking about Palestinians. He was telling me about all the Palestinian friends he had and how much he believed in the opportunity for peace. With his belief and my experiences, there was nothing I could do to help him. I made a commitment to myself after that if ever again an opportunity would come along to help to save a human life, I wouldn't rest. I would do everything possible to bring that person home. In April of 2006, I was attending a conference in Cairo. I go to a lot of conferences. This was a UN conference on the question of Palestine. While I was at the conference, a friend of mine from Gaza introduced me to another gentleman. As a professor of economics at the Islamic University of Gaza, a member of Hamas, Professor Mohammed Mikdad. Professor Mikdad had traveled from Gaza to Cairo because he thought there might be an Israeli at this conference and he wanted to talk to an Israeli. Mainly he wanted to talk to the Israeli and convince the Israelis that they should leave Israel and allow the Palestinians to have their state and live in peace. I had never met someone from Hamas before. He had never met a Jew before. We excused ourselves from the conference. I spent 6 hours with Mohammed Mikdad in dialogue. It was incredibly interesting and valuable. And we decided together that we would try to continue this dialogue and expand the circle and bring in others who might want to join, some other Hamas academics and some other Israeli academics. It wasn't possible to do this in Gaza or in Israel. No Israeli would, other than me, would go to Gaza. And no person from Hamas we could get into Israel. It was simply not possible. So I approached different countries and asked them if they would sponsor these talks. I found 4 countries that were willing to host the talks: Switzerland, Turkey, Norway, and Russia. We decided that we would do the first series of meetings in Russia. And the people from the Russian government in Moscow asked me to get copies of the passports of the Palestinian participants who would be coming. And I called Mohammed Mikdad in Gaza and asked him to put together the passports, and he said he would. And then they didn't come. And I waited a day, and 2 days, and a week, and I called him and said, "What's happening?" He said, "We're encountering some political problems. The people are scared to go without political coverage from the leadership of Hamas." So I traveled down to Gaza. I went to the Islamic University. I met with Mohammed Mikdad, and I met with his colleagues at the university, and understood that if they didn't have some kind of political coverage, they wouldn't go. So Mohammed and I got in his car, and we drove to the office of Prime Minister Haniya, the Hamas Prime Minister. And we met with Dr. Ahmed Yusuf. Both Hania and Ahmed Yusuf were on that page that I passed out, which, by the way, I hope to get back at the end of this meeting so that I can use it in other talks that I'm giving, reuse and recycle. We met with Dr. Ahmed Yusuf. Maybe some of you know his name. Ahmed Yusuf is the modern face of Hamas. He often pens op-eds in the Washington Post and the New York Times. He had spent a lot of times in Florida as a professor there. He knows the American language and speaks to American audiences. And he's one of the ideologues of Hamas. Dr. Yusuf said that he would join the group, which I thought was brilliant. It's wonderful that Dr. Ahmed Yusuf is joining the group. We have the political coverage we need. And once again, I went back to Jerusalem and waited for the passports to come. And they didn't come in a day, and 2 days, and a week went by. And then I understood that the political leadership was not going to allow this to happen. Professor McDodd explained to me that the Hamas leadership would not allow members of Hamas to engage in direct talks with Israelis. So we kept on our contact, and we talked by phone, and we chatted every so often. Parenthetically, I'll say that Mohammed McDodd himself did come to a conference that we did in Ankara 2 years later with Israelis. When he got back to Gaza after that conference, he found out that he was suspended from his position at the Islamic University for a year for attending a conference with Israelis. June 26, 2006, early in the morning, 8 Palestinian gunmen appear out of a tunnel on the Israeli side of the Gaza border in the Kerem Shalom army base. They see a tank in front of them. They shoot a rocket-propelled grenade at the tank, which goes on fire. 2 Israeli soldiers jump out of the tank and are shot and killed on the spot, Pavel Slutzker and Hanan Barak. A 3rd Israeli soldier comes out of the tank and is shot and wounded and dragged off into Gaza, Gilad Shalit. It takes about an hour before the army understands that they're missing a soldier. As soon as they realize, a military operation begins in Gaza to close off Gaza to make sure that Gilad Shalit won't be taken out of Gaza. 2 days later, Israel officially launches an operation called Summer Rains, aimed at finding Gilad Shalit, rescuing him, bringing him home, and also sending a message to the Palestinian public in Gaza that they would pay a very heavy price for holding on to an Israeli soldier. Infrastructure in Gaza was bombed by the Israeli Air Force. Other sites were cut off. Gaza was divided into 3 separate zones. On Shabbat morning, July 1st, I received a phone call from Professor Mohammed McDodd. He says to me, Gershon, we have no electricity, we have no water, we're being bombed, my kids are screaming, everyone's afraid, we have to do something to put an end to the situation. I asked him, Mohammed, what do you think we can do? He says, I think we need to open up a channel of communication. He asked me if I would be willing to speak to someone from Hamas. I said, of course. He went to the office of the Hamas Prime Minister. About half an hour later, I received a phone call from the Director General of the Hamas Prime Minister's office, Dr. Mohammed Madhoun, who told me that in a little while later I'd be receiving a phone call from someone else who would be my liaison to Hamas. About an hour later, I received a phone call from Ghazi Hamad. He's on the page, and he's a key figure in this whole story. Ghazi Hamad was the spokesperson of the Hamas government, which had been elected in the beginning of 2006. Ghazi Hamad was a veterinarian trained in Sudan. As a youth, he was arrested for being a member of Hamas. He spent 7 years in Israeli prison, during which time he learned English and Hebrew. He was the editor of the first Hamas newspaper, El Watan, the Citizen or the Homeland. He then ran and directed the Hamas newspaper called El Risali, the Messenger, or the Message. He was an intellectual and a thinker, and when he called me that morning in July, the beginning of July, the most unusual thing about his phone call to me was that he spoke to me in Hebrew. Ghazi Hamad suggested that we try and open up a line of communication officially. He thought that the best way to do it would be to contact the soldier's father, Noam Shalit. It took me a few hours to find Noam's phone number. When I did, I introduced myself to him as an Israeli peace activist who had some contacts with Hamas. I explained to him that I was contacted by Hamas and wanted to know if he was willing to speak to someone from the Hamas Prime Minister's office. Gilad Shalit said, of course. I want to know where my son is. I want to know if he's alive. I'll talk to anyone. Later in that day, a phone conversation took place between Gilad Shalit and Ghazi Hamad. That essentially began what was for me a mission of almost 5.5 years, in which almost every single day during those 5.5 years, I tried to do something to bring Gilad Shalit home. Gilad Shalit became my fourth child. He was in my home all the time. He was present in my consciousness, in my thoughts, always trying to think of what to do. The first thing that I knew that we needed to do was to produce a sign of life. Was he still alive? We didn't know. Hamas told me that he was, and that he was being treated well. They told me that they would treat him in accordance with Islam. I didn't know what that meant. I checked. The Quran mentions prisoners of war, and it says that Islam guarantees, orders, in fact, that prisoners of war be treated medically, that they be given shelter and be given food. I thought to myself, that's wonderful, that there are also those guarantees in Islam and that Hamas is treating him according to Islam. I thought to myself, and later said to a number of Hamas people, international law demands more, like visits from the Red Cross and contact with his family. Hamas agreed that they would provide a sign of life, a videotape, in exchange for Israel releasing 350 women and minor prisoners from Israeli jails. There were about 10,000 Palestinians in Israeli prison at that time. I needed to communicate this message to Prime Minister ALLMEP. I knew Prime Minister ALLMEP. I knew that if I approached his office, I would never get through to him, and my message would never get to him. But I wanted to make sure that my message got directly to him, and I picked up the phone and called his daughter, Dana. Dana ALLMEP was a well-known peace activist, much further to the left than her father. She said to me, Gershon, of course I'll deliver messages to my father with regard to Gilad Shalit, but I want you to know, she said, you know my father, he's not going to listen. She said, my father doesn't trust Arabs, and of all the Arabs he trusts the least is the Palestinians, but more than that, the people in the world that he has the least amount of trust for are Israelis who work with Palestinians. This was certainly true. I knew ALLMEP quite well. But nonetheless, we were talking about Gilad Shalit and not about Gershon Baskin. The message was transmitted to ALLMEP by Dana. She came back to me and said, my father said we don't negotiate with terrorists. We will not release prisoners. We know that Gilad Shalit is alive and we hold Hamas responsible for his well-being, and we won't pay anything for information. I thought to myself that the value of a sign of life from Gilad Shalit was not only in proving that he was alive, but perhaps even more importantly, we needed to prove that the channel of communication was leading to the people who were actually holding him. How else could we prove that we're talking to the people who are holding him? But I also was well aware that the best situation for Israel would have been a military operation that would heroically bring him home without having to negotiate with terrorists or releasing Palestinian prisoners from jail. And there was no doubt in my mind that that was what the Israeli army was busy doing. But I also remembered that in 1995, during the time of Prime Minister Rabin, an Israeli soldier was abducted by Hamas, Gershon Baskin, and after several days, the Israeli Shin Bet found out where he was being held, sent in a commando raid, and Gershon Baskin was killed along with the officer who led the commando raid. I thought to myself, what if there is no military operation possible that could bring Gilad Shalit alive? We must have a channel of communication in order to negotiate, and I insisted that we have that. I pushed Hamas to be more compromising on what they were demanding, explaining that ALLMEP would not release any prisoners for information, They refused. I then went to the headquarters of President Abbas in Ramallah and asked President Abbas to be involved in the negotiations. I sat in on Friday morning with one of his top advisors, and we called Hamas in Gaza, and they successfully negotiated Hamas down to one busload of women and minor prisoners, 50 prisoners. They even agreed that the busload of prisoners would be delivered to Ramallah, to President Abbas, who would get the credit, rather than Hamas. And I transmitted this information to Prime Minister Olmert's Chief of Staff, Yoram Turbovich, and once again received the answer no. But you know, all along here now, we're several weeks into the situation. On June 12th, Hezbollah crossed the northern border of Israel, attacked a patrol, and kidnapped 2 Israeli soldiers into Lebanon. We now have 2 abducted soldiers in Lebanon and an abducted soldier in Gaza, a military operation taking place in Gaza. By the time the war in Lebanon had started, there were already 40 dead Palestinians in Gaza, infrastructure under attack. Israel's going to war now in Lebanon, trying to bring back the 2 soldiers who were abducted into Lebanon. The world's attention is focused on Lebanon, not on Gaza. I proposed to Hamas to allow Gilad Shalit to call home. No phone calls came. Hamas began shooting rockets into Israel in response to the Israeli military operation. I proposed to both sides to engage in a ceasefire. Hamas says that they're ready for a ceasefire. Olmert said no ceasefire until they release Gilad Shalit. I made contact with a friend of mine in the Egyptian embassy, the intelligence officer in the Egyptian embassy, General Nader al-Assa. He's not on the page because I couldn't find a picture of Nader anywhere. Next time I go to Egypt, I'm going to take Nader's picture when he's not looking at me, because he won't give me a picture of himself. Nader was the Egyptian intelligence office in the Egyptian embassy in Tel Aviv. He was a very good friend of mine, and he's a big friend of peace. And I asked Nader if the Egyptians would get involved. He said to me that he knew that they already were. The Egyptian office in Gaza was already communicating with the Hamas to try and bring about the release of Gilad Shalit. On August 14th, 50 days after Gilad Shalit was abducted, Prime Minister Olmert finally appointed someone in his office to deal with the case. 50 days after the abduction. Ofer Dekel had been the deputy head of the Shin Bet. He was not promoted to be head of the Shin Bet. He resigned from the Shin Bet. He was a jockey mate of Olmert's. They were good friends. And Olmert asked Ofer Dekel to come in and be in charge of the file of the missing soldiers. I contacted Ofer Dekel. I was given his phone number by the Shalit family. I explained to him what I was doing. He was appointed on the 14th. We agreed that we would meet in the morning of the 18th. In the interim, on the 16th, I went to Gaza. I went to Gaza to meet Ghazi Hamid and to try and figure out how we could get a sign of life without a payment. In my meeting with Ghazi Hamid in Gaza, I suggested to him that Hamas provide a handwritten letter from Gilad Shalit without any payment. A letter is easier to do than a videotape. They have less risks in terms of being discovered. Ghazi Hamid liked the idea and told me to wait in Gaza. I waited in Gaza until dark fell. I wasn't going to stay overnight. I went back to Jerusalem. The next morning I spoke to Ghazi Hamid, who told me that the idea was being advanced. The following day Ghazi Hamid told me that a letter would be on its way. And I waited a day, and 2 days, and 3 days, and a week. And I've been there before, and no letter came. I'm speaking to Ghazi Hamid 10 times a day. I remember vividly sitting in the car with Ghazi on the speakerphone, and my wife is next to me, and my wife says to me, he's lying to you. He's making a fool of you. How can you believe him? And I felt in my heart that she was right, but there was something about Ghazi Hamid that made me believe him. That there was in fact a letter, but there were political problems with the letter being released. And I wrote a letter to Khaled Mashal, one of the leaders of Hamas in Damascus. I got his email, I got his fax number. I got it, by the way, from the radio station where I have a talk show, All for Peace Radio. They had interviewed Khaled Mashal on radio. I verified that Khalid Mashal got the letter. I appealed to Khalid Mashal to release the letter from Gilad Shalit so that we could establish a line of communication. They refused. They would not accept a phone call from Israel. I called someone who I had met previously at a conference, Dr. Azam Tamimi. His picture is on the page. Azam Tamimi is from Hebron, a Palestinian who left Israel many years ago and set up an Institute for Political Islam in London. He has an Arabic satellite television station called Al-Hiwar Dialogue. He's a member, or he claims that he's not a member of Hamas. I believe he is, but he's very close to Khalid Mashal. And I asked Dr. Azam Tamimi if he will be a liaison between me and Damascus, the Hamas office there, and he agreed. He called Khalid Mashal, and he reported back to me that Gilad Shalit was well, and that the reason that Hamas would not release the letter is because Israel has not indicated a willingness to negotiate. And only after they hear from Israel that there was a willing to negotiate, they would release the letter. We know what ALLMEP's position was, and that remained to be his official position. That was the message he was also giving to the Egyptians in Gaza. We will not negotiate, we demand that Gilad Shalit be released. This went on for another couple of weeks. We're now a week before Ramadan. I thought that Ramadan was a good time to once again try to appeal to the Hamas on a humanitarian basis to release the letter. I meet with Noam and Aviva Shalit. I suggest to Noam that he write a letter, father to Khalid Mashal, and to appeal to his humanitarian senses as a father, to know at least the welfare of my son, that he's alive. Noam wrote a brilliant letter. He quoted from the Quran. He sat with a Palestinian lawyer friend of his from Nazareth, wrote a beautiful letter. We translated the letter to Arabic, sent it off to Khalid Mashal. Khalid Mashal received the letter on September 7th, 2006, 2.5 months after Gilad was abducted. On Shabbat morning, September 9th, 2006, at 11 o'clock in the morning, Ghazi Hamid called me and said, Gershon, the letter from Gilad Shalit just arrived at the Egyptian headquarters in Gaza. It takes about half an hour to verify that in fact there was a letter. I called up Noam and Aviva Shalit and told them there was a letter from Gilad. I called up Ofer Dekel, who I had met several days before, and informed him there was a letter. Ofer Dekel called me later in the day and said, Gershon, thank you very much for what you did. From this moment on, you're out. We don't need your help anymore. The Egyptians are now taking over the negotiations. I thought to myself, what interest does Egypt have in facilitating these negotiations? We're talking about the regime of Hosni Mubarak, who made illegal the Muslim Brotherhood Party, of which Hamas is an outgrowth of. There was nothing in my mind that convinced me that the Egyptians were actually interested in enabling an agreement that would empower Hamas and would empower the Muslim Brotherhood. I had great suspicion, and I couldn't understand why the Israelis were willing to have the Egyptians mediate. I called my friend Nader Lasser, the intelligence officer in the Egyptian embassy in Tel Aviv, and we agreed to meet the next day in Tel Aviv. He told me that his colleagues were sincere. They were going to try to negotiate an agreement, that Egypt didn't want an Israeli attack against Gaza because that would rile the Egyptian public against Israel and against the peace treaty. So they were sincere in their efforts, but Nader Lasser told me also, don't listen to Ofer Dekel, he said to me. We need a free agent, someone who can deliver messages, who's not a government official, who's not tied or linked to anyone. We need someone like you who can act in the background. And I decided to listen to Nader Lasser and to continue to do everything I could to bridge the gaps, to pass on messages. I was beginning to hear from people in Hamas that negotiations had begun. In December 2006, Israel and Hamas, through the Egyptians, reached a framework agreement. They agreed that Gilad Shalit would be exchanged for 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. They agreed that the prisoner deal would be broken into two phases. The first phase, a list of 450 names that Hamas would select. They agreed that in the second phase, a list of 550 prisoners would be selected by Israel and authorized by the Egyptians. December 2006. In October 2011, when the deal was implemented, that was the deal. 1,000 prisoners, two phases, 450, 550. An additional 27 women were added to the list at the end because they were overseen when they were negotiating the list. But I asked myself continually, 5 years after they reached the framework agreement, Gilad Shalit sat in captivity, underground in Gaza. Why? I would ask myself, Ofer Dekel has a team of people from military intelligence, from the Mossad, from the Shin Bet. What does he do every morning when he goes to work? I was getting messages after the framework agreement was reached that the negotiations were stuck. The Hamas, it took them 3 months to submit a list of names. I couldn't understand what we were waiting for. Why didn't Israel take an initiative? Why didn't we put out a list of names? I had suggested to ALLMEP to publish a list of 2,000 names that Israel was willing to release, to put it on every Arabic website in the world and let the Palestinian public put pressure on their leadership to make a deal. Israel waited for 3 months for Hamas to submit a list of 350 names, not even 450 names, as was the framework agreement, and the Israelis agreed to release 40 from the 350 names. The Israeli cabinet made a committee under the leadership of Chaim Ramon, a minister in the government, to examine criteria for the release of prisoners. The list was expanded to 70 and didn't move forward. By this time, rounds of violence in the end of October 2007 had emerged between Fatah and Hamas on the ground, the beginning of the conflict there. I propose a secret meeting to take place between Ofer Dekel and Razi Hamad. Razi Hamad agrees that he would meet secretly to open up a direct secret back channel between Israel and Hamas, as I understand that the Egyptian talks are not moving anywhere. Ofer Dekel speaks to ALLMEP, and ALLMEP refuses. A week after Gaza explodes in violence, the Egyptians are now focusing their attention on mediating between Fatah and Hamas, and not between Israel and Hamas. No talks are going on whatsoever. Out of frustration, I think to myself, we need to find a different mediator. We need to find someone else who's willing to help here. I thought that Syria was a key. I had an opportunity to be in Madrid in January 2007. It was marking 15 years since the Madrid conference that took place after the First Gulf War under President Bush the father and Gorbachev. And all the original delegations that were at the first Madrid conference were there in Madrid 15 years later, including a delegation from Syria. I found myself, by surprise, in an elevator, together with the Israeli journalist, a good friend of mine, Akiva Eldar from Haaretz, and the 2 Syrian delegation leaders, Dr. Riyad Daoudi, who was the legal advisor to President Assad, and Buthaina Sha'ban, who was then and still is the spokesperson of the Assad regime. Akiva Eldar extended his hand to Dr. Riyad Daoudi and asked him if he would agree to be interviewed to Haaretz. The Syrians pushed a button on the elevator to get out before their floor. They wouldn't even look at us. I asked one of my Palestinian friends in the Madrid conference if he would approach the Syrians and ask if they would speak to me with regard to Gilad Shalit. And Daoudi agreed. And I spoke to Daoudi and asked him if he would speak to President Assad about applying pressure on the Hamas to negotiate with more chances of reaching agreement, understanding that there were limitations to who and how many people Israel could release. He acknowledged the conversation and didn't make any promises. In April of that year, a couple of months later, I found myself sitting next to the man who was in charge of the proximity talks that were taking place between Israel and Syria at the time through the Turkish government, a guy named Dr. Samir Taki. Samir's a cardiologist and ran a think tank in Syria and was appointed by Assad together with Daoudi to conduct these negotiations with the ALLMEP government on a solution for the Israeli-Syrian conflict with the help of the Turkish government. For 3 days I sat next to Dr. Samir Taki. He, by the way, 2 weeks ago appeared in Dubai and gave a press conference and announced that he was joining the opposition to Bashar al-Assad, and I commend him for that from here. Dr. Samir Taki told me that he would speak to Assad and try to work to get Gilad Shalit released. I said he was a cardiologist, a man who understood life and death. But we weren't moving anywhere. By the following month, May 2007, Gaza was in full civil war. June 7th, 2007, Hamas committed the final act of coup d'etat and brutally executed people from Fatah, throwing them off the roof of buildings. The Fatah troops left Gaza. Hamas took over Gaza. The Egyptians left Gaza. There was no longer any channel for negotiations between Hamas, Egypt, and Israel. I contacted Ahmed Youssef, the intellectual ideologue in Haniyeh's office, and asked if Hamas was interested in negotiating an agreement. He said yes, they were. He proposed that Israel take an initiative and put forward a list of names, but I was contacted later by Razi Hamad, who told me that Khalid Mashal refused to accept any list of names. We were really stuck here. Nothing was moving. Gaza's under control of Hamas now, full control. Egypt is out, no negotiations going on. I begged Ahmed Youssef to at least provide another sign of life. We hadn't heard from Gilad Shalit since September 2006. Shortly after we received that letter from Gilad Shalit, I asked the Shalits to write Gilad a letter and send it. It was a couple of days before Rosh Hashanah. And I tried to send that letter to Gilad. I got a phone call from the Egyptians in Gaza who were angry at me for trying to pass the letter on to Gilad Shalit, not through them. By the way, there were tens of attempts over the 5 years and 4 months to deliver a letter from the family to Gilad Shalit. He received one letter from his family. It was the letter delivered by President Carter to Khalid Mashal. That was the only letter that Gilad Shalit had actually received in the 5 years and 4 months from his family. He didn't receive the one that I sent. 2 days after my appeal to Ahmed Youssef that Hamas should release another side of the life, Hamas issued an audio tape from Gilad saying that he was alive, saying that the government, it was actually a written text that was written by Hamas for him, where he castigated the Israeli government for not acting on behalf of his relief, and that Palestinians should be released from Israeli jails. The message didn't matter much. What mattered was that Gilad was still alive. June 26, 2007, a full year went by. We're not any closer to bringing Gilad home. In August 8, 2007, Razi Hamad calls me and suggests that we try to initiate a secret direct back channel again. Declan says no, but several weeks later, while I'm attending a conference abroad, these things always happen when I'm abroad, because they knew that it cost me 10 times more to make phone calls when I'm abroad than when I'm at home. This is the way it always happened whenever I was abroad. 3 weeks later, Declan says okay to a secret back channel, but then Hamas says no. This was never in sync. Never in sync could we get the two sides to agree to the same time to talk to each other. I go along looking for other mediators. I speak to the advisor of the Norwegian Prime Minister, who speaks to his Prime Minister, and the Norwegians say, yes, we're willing to intervene on the condition that both sides ask us and we're the only ones. Neither side would do that. I go to the Russian embassy. I know the intelligence officer of the Russian embassy, who thinks that this is so serious he gets in a plane and flies to Moscow and talks to Putin. And Putin agrees that the Russians would mediate on the condition that both sides ask them, and they're the only mediators, and they wouldn't do that. Escalation emerges between Israel and Hamas, and we go through another few rounds of rocket fire back and forth. November 2007, President Bush announces the Annapolis Conference. Now all attention is turned back to here, and the Annapolis process and negotiations between ALLMEP and Hamas and Tzipi Livni and Abu Allah, and attention is once again not focused on Gilad Shalit. July 16, 2008, a big surprise. An announcement is made that an agreement has been reached between Hezbollah and Israel through the mediation of a German intelligence officer, Dr. Gerhard Konrad, his picture is on the page, a senior intelligence officer with experience working in the Islamic world, managed to arrive at an agreement for an exchange of the 2 Israeli soldiers in Lebanon. In exchange for all the Lebanese prisoners in Israeli jails, Israel was holding a number of senior Lebanese people who had actually been taken hostage by Israel after the falling of navigator Ron Arad in the 1982 Lebanon War. Ron Arad was held by Syrian forces from Amal at the beginning, eventually transferred to the Iranians. Israel lost the opportunity to negotiate for Ron Arad. He disappeared. He's dead. Israel had been holding on to these Lebanese prisoners for years, hoping that they would give some information about what happened to Ron Arad. Now Israel had to release them. And Israel also released a Palestinian terrorist, Samir Kuntar, who had murdered the Haran family from Nahariya, a very brutal murder, including a young girl who was killed. And a tragic story of a mother who ended up suffocating her own child so that the child wouldn't scream as they were in hiding when the terrorists were killing her family. Samir Kuntar was released to Lebanon and was given a hero's welcome there. This was a very traumatic prisoner exchange for Israeli society. The 2 soldiers came back in coffins. There was a hope that Udi Goldwasser and Eldad Regev would come back alive. It was a hope that lasted almost to the very last moment. And as our eyes were fixated on television, seeing the 2 coffins come off the Red Cross trucks, we knew that what the army had been telling us for months in preparation, that there was not a very good chance that they were alive, was what happened. The only good thing that came out of the release of the 2 soldiers from Lebanon is that Dr. Gerhard Konrad agreed to take over the mediation with Hamas, and he had a proven success. The German government embraced the mission and provided an enormous amount of resources which they paid for, a private jet, a team, information, time. Angela Merkel gave everything that was possible that a country could give to facilitate these negotiations. Gerhard Konrad began his mission. He made some 50 visits back and forth to Israel and to Gaza. He had established a very good relationship with Dr. Mahmoud Zahar, who's on the list, one of the leaders of Hamas, who was the Hamas foreign minister. Zahar, thought to be one of the extremists in Gaza, was appointed by Ahmed Jabari. He's on the list, look at his picture. Ahmed Jabari was the commander of the Ezzedin al-Qassam forces, the military wing of Hamas. The strong man of Gaza, the man who was responsible for the coup d'etat, controlled Gaza with his military might, and he was the man responsible for holding Gilad Shalit. He had appointed Mahmoud Zahar to negotiate with Dr. Konrad. The relationship between Mahmoud Zahar and Dr. Konrad was very close. They became very close friends. I thought that was a very good sign, because what was missing in this whole talking was some sign of humanity and human contact, and perhaps even friendship. And I thought a friendship between the German mediator and Mahmoud Zahar could only help the situation. I was getting mixed rumors that the talks were progressing, the talks were stuck, they were progressing, Konrad was coming back and forth, making progress. By November 2008, the situation flared up once again between Hamas and Israel. There had been a ceasefire for 11 months. Israel attacked a tunnel that was being used for smuggling weapons into Gaza. Some Hamas fighters were killed in the tunnel. Hamas began launching rockets into Israel, to the civilian population, Qassam rockets, Grad rockets that reached as far as Ashkelon. Israel retaliated with fire back on Hamas, artillery fire. Hamas saw the might of the Israeli army and declared a 24-hour ceasefire. Israel hit a cell from Hamas the next day during the 24-hour ceasefire. Hamas responded with 80 rockets being sent into Israel the following day. And on December 27, 2008, Cast-Lead began. The Israeli military operation in Gaza. There's no doubt in my mind, although undeclared, that one of the intentions of Cast-Lead was to do the military operation to bring out Gilad Shalit. From everything I know and have been told, the Israelis knew where Shalit was being held until Kaslet. The assessment was, after a military operation had gone out once to rescue Shalit and was called back, that the place was booby-trapped and there was no way of getting him out alive. They thought that perhaps in Kaslet they would find him and bring him out alive. That, of course, didn't happen. After Kaslet, Prime Minister Olmert got into trouble not only on what was happened in the Lebanon War and the investigation of the Lebanon War, but he was then indicted for corruption and forced to resign. February 10th, 2009, Israel went to elections and Netanyahu was elected. I was convinced, I admit now wrongly, that Netanyahu would never make a deal. Everything that we knew about Netanyahu, everything that he has ever said about negotiating with terrorists, that he's written in his books and he's lectured the world that we don't negotiate with terrorists, I was convinced that Gilad Shalit would be left behind. Netanyahu's attitude was that he was a soldier who went to war to protect his country, and he was killed in battle. The only problem was that Gilad Shalit was alive. Netanyahu asked Olmert to finish the job before he left office. Netanyahu didn't want to find the Shalit file on his desk when he took over the Prime Minister's office, which he did in the end of March. Olmert was under enormous public pressure to make a deal. And on his last day in office, the cabinet met and voted against a deal. Olmert refused to budge. Netanyahu took over March 31st, 2009. Nothing was done on behalf of Gilad Shalit for 2 months. Netanyahu appointed Haggai Hadass. He was not appointed to be head of the Mossad. He resigned from the Mossad and went into business. I could never understand why they appointed people who weren't promoted to deal this with this file. It doesn't make sense to me. Both Overdeko had not been appointed to be head of the Shin Bet, resigned. He became in charge. Haggai Hadass had not been promoted to be head of the Mossad, resigned. He became in charge. I needed to talk to Haggai Hadass. How do you make contact with someone from Mossad in the 21st century?
Cell phone.
Facebook. I type in Haggai Hadass to Facebook, and there comes his picture that appeared in the newspaper. It didn't have a phone number for him, but he told me that he lived in the town of Maccabim outside of Modi'in, halfway between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. I called up telephone information and asked for Haggai Hadass in Maccabim, and they gave me his home phone number. I called his home and speak to his daughter, who was very nice, and said that Abba's not home right now. Can I have his cell number? She said, of course. I called up Haggai Hadass and explained who I was and that I was dealing with the Hamas and trying to bring Gilad Shalit home. He told me to call him a week later. I called him a week later, and I heard from him what ended up to be the mantra that I heard from him over the next 2 years. We have a German mediator. We don't need your help. Thank you. Every time over the next 2 years that I approached Haggai Hadass, that's what I heard from him. The truth of the matter is that after some 50 or 60 visits to Israel and Gaza, Dr. Gerhard Konrad disappeared. No one knew what happened to him. The negotiations were frozen. I was hearing from Razi Hamad and Azam Tamimi and other people on the Israeli cabinet that there were no negotiations going on. We were waiting for the German to come back with a proposal. In November of 2009, after months of not being there, Gerhard Konrad comes back with a draft agreement. He gives it to both sides. Hamas immediately rejects the proposal, announces that they reject it. Konrad goes back to Germany. He comes back a month later with a new draft. He gives the draft to the Palestinians, to Hamas, and to Israel. Ahmed Jabari, the person holding Gilad Shalit, in a rage, fires Mahmoud Zahar, the foreign minister, from being involved in the case, refuses to speak to Mahmoud Zahar, and no one knows what's happening. He never responded to the question of the German mediator of whether or not they agreed. Netanyahu went on national television and made a speech in which he said that Israel agreed to this agreement. It was easy at that point because he knew the Hamas rejected it. And he outlined the red lines of Israel in terms of who could be released and who could not be released and why. I thought we were heading at a dead end. I used my column in the Jerusalem Post to write an article which I called The Forgotten Soldier, which I said that no one was interested in Gilad Shalit being freed at this point. In my assessment, Ahmed Jabri was holding on to Shalit because he was a source of power, and he was a life insurance policy. Jabri's predecessor, Mohammed Deif, who had founded Ezzeddin al-Qassam, had been hit 3 times by Israel in attempts to kill him. He was severely wounded. This guy's a cat with 9 lives. He's still alive. But Ahmed Jabri didn't want to end up in the same situation as Mohammed Deif. And Gilad Shalit was an insurance policy. As long as he was holding Shalit, he's safe. This is how I understood the situation. We're in a stalemate. We're not going anywhere. And negotiations are not happening. Jabri fired Mahmoud al-Zahar. Israel's waiting for a response from the Hamas. I pick up the phone and call Haggai Hadass, who refuses to talk to me. I send him text messages. He responds to me by text message. We have a German mediator, but I know the German is gone. He's not there anymore. Nothing is happening. In April 2010, in July of 2010, I received a phone call from Razi Hamad, who tells me that Jabri is ready for a deal. He sends me a document in Arabic which indicates all the areas that Hamas is willing to compromise. Now let's be realistic here in terms of Hamas compromises. They were not willing to not implement a deal of 1,000 to 1. They were not willing to give up all these people who had killed Israelis as part of the deal that they wanted to be released. But they did indicate a willingness to make a deal. They did indicate a willingness to release, to compromise on some of the prisoner names and some of the categories. What the German mediator had done, I understood at this point, was establish criteria, categories of prisoners. Hamas had demanded that the list include Palestinians from every sector of Palestine, meaning that there would be Palestinians from inside, what they call the 1948 Palestinians, Palestinians who were citizens of Israel and had killed Israelis, Palestinians from East Jerusalem, who, although not citizens of Israel, they were permanent residents of Israel. They would be included. Women and minors, prisoners who had killed Israelis from before Oslo, and prisoners who had killed Israelis after Oslo, prisoners from all parts of Palestine and from all political movements, from Fatah, from Hamas, from the Popular Front, from the Communist, everyone. Hamas wanted to present itself as the leader of the Palestinian people, and they were worried and concerned about all Palestinians without regard to where they're from and what political movement they were based from. They indicated a willingness in all these categories to make compromises with the Israeli demands. The Israeli demands had been that the majority of them be deported from the region or to Gaza, and that the most serious murderers of Israelis, those who had killed the most, would not be included in the deal. Hamas indicated a willingness in July 2010 for that. I received this document and sent it to Haggai Hadass through the Prime Minister's office, to the military attaché. I got a response from Haggai Hadass that we have a German mediator and we don't need your help. I sent it to Ehud Barak, the Minister of Defense, and asked Ehud Barak to be the responsible adult and to understand that there was an opportunity to reach an agreement with Hamas on compromise. Ehud Barak's office director sent me a note saying we transferred the document to the person responsible for it in the Prime Minister's office, meaning Haggai Hadass. I sat on the phone one evening for 2 hours, I'm not exaggerating, for 2 hours, texting Haggai Hadass, Haggai, speak to me. And he refused. He told the Shalit family that they should not talk to me. He told the Shalit family that my contacts in Hamas were, this is a quote, Razi Hamad is the Yossi Beilin of Hamas. Yossi Beilin was an Israeli politician from the left, from the Meretz party. He was the initiator of Oslo, and while a brilliant and creative politician, he had no influence in Israel. So Razi Chabad, I was being told by the Shalit family, Chagai Hadas, I told them, is the Yossi Beilin of Hamas. I didn't understand this because Razi Chabad was no longer the spokesperson of the government. He had resigned from that position after the Hamas coup d'etat, and he was very critical of the Hamas position. But a little while later, he was appointed to be the liaison between the government and the military wing of Hamas. And in that capacity, he developed a very close relationship with Ahmed Jabri, who was holding Gilad Shalit. In fact, he was spending evenings talking to Ahmed Jabri and was convinced that Jabri was ready for a deal, but I was being told that my contacts in Hamas are irrelevant. I'm getting to the end. January 2011, revolution in Egypt. 18 days of protest in Tahrir Square in Cairo and around the country, and the 30-year regime of Hosni Mubarak is history. We have a new Egypt. In the same period, uprisings begin across the Arab world, the most significant for our story in Syria. The Syrian regime hits a Palestinian refugee camp. Palestinians are Sunnis. Tehran demands from Hamas, its supporter, to support the Assad regime. Hamas leadership in Syria decides that they cannot do that any longer. They make a decision, secretively, to exit Syria. They called their operation soft exit. They began moving people out of Syria. Tehran, in understanding that the Hamas want to leave Syria, offer Khaled Mashal and the leadership a home base in Tehran. Hamas leadership rejects the offer. They want to go to Cairo. They approach the Egyptians. The Egyptians understand there's a new situation now. They have leverage over Hamas. I pick up the phone and call my friend Nader Lasser, who used to be in the Egyptian embassy, and suggest to Nader that there's a new opportunity for negotiations here. Nader recognizes it by now. He's the head of the Israel desk in the Egyptian intelligence in Cairo. April 13th, Chagai Hadas resigns in failure. April 18th, Netanyahu appoints a new man to be in the job, responsible, this time an acting Mossad agent with the rank of general in Mossad, David Meidan. I'd never heard of him before. He wasn't in Facebook. But I knew someone who had been in the Mossad, who was the same family name as him. Pini Meidan had been in the Mossad, then worked in Prime Minister Barak's office as a political advisor on the peace process. I was a member of an experts committee on Jerusalem during the time of Barak's prime ministership, and I knew Pini from that work, and we had worked together afterwards in multiple Track 2 exercises of bringing Israelis and Palestinians together. And I picked up the phone and asked Pini if he knew David Meidan, if they were relatives. He said, we're not relatives, I know him, why? I told him Gilad Shalit matters. He said, fine, you want me to talk to him for you? I said, yes. He called David and got permission from David to give me his phone number. I called David. David said to me, give me 3 weeks. I need to get into the job to learn the file. I call him back after 3 weeks. He says, I need another week. I call up Razi Hamad and say, there's a new man in the Prime Minister's office, let's start trying again. I pick up the phone to Nader in Egypt and tell Nader that I'm renewing my contacts and trying to negotiate a direct back channel, and I'm speaking to Razi Hamad every day. Nader laughs at me, and he says, Gershon, you're speaking to Razi 5 times a day, we're all listening to you. I met David Meidan after he had gone to his team and said, we have nothing. We have no links, we have no contacts, we have no mediation, we have no agreements, we have nothing. There is this guy Baskin who claims that he has contacts to Hamas. I should preface this by saying that when he took over the job, Chagai Hadas stood around for another month. It took a month before he left. David didn't want to start any new initiatives until Chagai Hadass wasn't there. He told me as an intelligence officer, the first thing that an intelligence officer does when they take over a new file is to clear what he called the noise in the room. There were offers from the whole world to help. Lots of different countries, lots of different individuals, a lot of religious people, and then the kooks, the stargazers, the coffee cup readers, the seance runners who said they could establish a contact with Gilad Shalit and bring him home. So it took another couple of weeks before they cleared the room for the noise, and then David went to his team, who were from military intelligence, the Mossad and the Shin Bet, and he said, what about this guy Baskin? And they said, oh, that pinko leftist peacenik, he can't help. And David looked at them and said, we have nothing. Nothing. No leads. I'm going to check them out. And David called me and asked me to send a message to Hamas. And I picked up the phone and called Razi Hamad and delivered the message and asked that the message be given to Jabari. And I told him I was waiting for his response. And an hour later, Razi called me back with a response from Jabari. And I called up David and gave him the response. He was blown away. He gave me another message to deliver. I delivered the message, and it came back within an hour. And the team couldn't believe it, because through all the mediation they had, all the help they had from the different mediators, it would take days, weeks, sometimes months before they got a response from Hamas. And now in real time, they're getting responses, and they say, we have to check this out further. And the intelligence community is listening to the communications, both through my phone, my email, my chat. I'm chatting with Razi Hamad every morning on MSN chat. We're sending emails and talking on the telephone. And they verify the channel. These messages are leading directly to the people holding Gilad Shalit. I met with David Meidan for the first time in the middle of May, after being in daily contact several times a day during those couple of weeks. I came home from that meeting after we spent 3 hours together talking, and I told my wife, I'm bringing Gilad Shalit home. I was convinced at that point that we had a secret direct channel, that there was a willingness to negotiate. David Meidan told me to give the message to Hamas that if they're seriously willing to make compromises, within 3 days of intensive negotiations, we can arrive at an agreement. That was the message that I got. Razi Hamad and I started working on a document of principles. The first document that he sent me, I sent it to David Meidan, and he looked at it. He told me to tell Razi Hamad that he refused to accept it, that I sent it back to him, and that they had to understand there were limitations of how far nothing else would go. This document included the names of the worst terrorists who had killed more Israelis than anyone else. They're what we call the symbols of the struggle from the Hamas side, and there was no way that Netanyahu released him. I spent 20 minutes on the phone telling Razi Hamad that there wasn't a prime minister in Israel alive who could ever release these people. They had to understand that there were limits. I suggested to Razi Hamad that he understand that in order for us to succeed, he and I had to work as a team. It would not work if I was negotiating with him. We had to come up with solutions and then present those solutions to the Israeli side and the Hamas side, and only if we worked as a joint mediating team, we could manage to solve all the problems. There were all these categories involved. I was getting information both from the Hamas side and from David and the Israeli team about the German agreement. There was an agreement that we would base the progress on the work that the German had included in his proposal. The German had included categories. I mentioned one of the categories that shocked me when I learned about was that there was a list of 50 names of the arch-terrorists who the German mediator called the VIP list. Those had killed the most amount of Israelis. They were on the VIP list. This was a big nut to crack because Israel would not release all 50 names that were in the original list. There was another category that perplexed me, the category of Israeli Arabs, Israeli citizens of Israel. Israel refused to release them. The German mediator had made an agreement, or had written in the agreement in Annex 13 of his draft, that the prisoners from Israeli Arabs, the 1948 category, would be released sometime following the deal, but not as part of the deal. This really perplexed me, and I spent one evening with the Israeli team trying to understand the German proposal. First thing I said to the Israeli team was, Annex 13 of the agreement dealt with Israeli Arabs. how many annexes were in the agreement? They said to me, 15. I said, how long was this agreement? 150 pages. I almost fell off my seat. This was an experienced German intelligence officer. Was he making a merger between Mercedes-Benz and Siemens? Did he think that the Hamas had a legal department that could sit and analyze this document? Now I understood why Jabari fired Mahmoud al-Zahar. He accused Zahar of working for the Israelis. He accused the German mediator of being an Israeli agent, and he canceled the talks. On July 14th, Razi Khalid and I arrived at a breakthrough document. It was the first time in 5 years that Hamas wrote on the top of a document, closure, finality, what it will take to close a deal with Israel. David Meidan took that agreement, that proposal, back to Netanyahu and got a green light to finish the negotiations. At this point, we have an official back channel going on. I received an official letter of appointment from the Israeli government. There are 8 people who know about this track. The condition of running it, of course, was that it remained secret. The Prime Minister knew, his military attaché, the head of the Mossad, the head of the Shin Bet, the Chief of Staff of the Israeli Army, and a couple of other people. My wife and my children. We continued these negotiations, making progress. We wanted to do it direct, face-to-face, so Razi Khalid wouldn't come to Israel. We had talked about going to Turkey. David didn't want us to go to Turkey because he said, as an intelligence officer, he would have to involve the Turkish intelligence. In the end, Jabari insisted that it be in Egypt. This time, Hamas was moving part of its headquarters to Egypt. We sat and analyzed that Egypt would be the right place to do it. Now, the Egyptians had a tremendous amount of leverage at this point over Hamas. Nader al-Assad agreed to be the person conducting the negotiations. David went to Cairo, met with the head of Egyptian intelligence, Muafi. It was decided that Nader would be the head of the Egyptian team. David and Nader hit it off wonderfully. Not only had Nader lived in Tel Aviv for 6 years and really appreciated Israel and liked Israeli society, but David Meidan was an Egyptian Jew who spoke Arabic with an Egyptian accent and got along with Nader wonderfully. 2 rounds of talks happened in Cairo. Jabari pulls his own trick. You might remember, during the course of the 5 years, the Israelis kept saying Hamas keeps raising the price. It didn't, in fact, raise the price. What Jabari would do is every time he came to negotiations with another mediator, he would change the list. This drove the Israeli system crazy because they would spend months going over every single name in the list trying to decide to what extent these people are dangerous to release. In Cairo, in round 3 of the talks, Jabari shows up with a list of 153 new names in replacement for the list of 50 names that were there previously. It was agreed that Israel would select 25 of the 50 names from the VIP category, and Hamas had agreed that the overwhelming majority of them could be deported forever. Hamas agreed to that. And then Jabari shows up with this new list of 153 names. I fly to Cairo. I went for a conference, that was my excuse. And I met with the Egyptian mediators. They wanted to know from me how strong Israel was locked into this keeping to the list. I explained to Nader and his colleague that this was a game breaker. If they changed the list, Israel withdraws from the negotiations. I also said to the Egyptians that it's time for them to put their own proposal on the table because we could haggle back and forth forever now. The Egyptians had to become the point of reference in the negotiations, and they should put down a proposal of their own. That evening, the Israeli embassy was attacked. I was staying in a hotel in Zamalek. Zamalek's an island in the middle of the Nile. I was on the Giza side of Zamalek. The Israeli embassy is in Giza. I heard gunfire at night. I thought it was a wedding. Often at our weddings they shoot gunfire into the air. I wake up in the morning and find out I'm the last Israeli left in Egypt. I was going to actually travel back together with a Palestinian friend over Sinai to go back to Israel. We wanted to go overland. I wanted to see Sinai. I haven't been there in a long time. Nader called me in the morning and said, Gershon, fly. I listened to him. August 18th, there's a terrorist attack across the Sinai into Israel. Gunmen shoot at a bus, 8 Israelis are killed. Israel responds with attacking and killing 6 leaders of the Popular Resistance Committees. That didn't come from Gaza, it was in Egypt. The Popular Resistance Committees weren't involved. Now we're losing control of the situation on the ground. The Islamic Jihad and the Popular Resistance Committee start shooting rockets into Israel. Israel, of course, retaliates. And I'm holding my breath thinking that every single one of these rockets that falls in Israel or in Gaza, killing people is going to not only kill people, which is a horrible tragedy, but it's also going to end the negotiations. The Qassam rockets, the Grab rockets that they fire into Israel is what we call a statistical weapon. Usually they fall nowhere in open space and don't do any damage. But they can also land on a school bus or on a supermarket or in a crowded place, and they can kill a lot of people. We needed a ceasefire, we needed it quickly. The attack was on a Thursday. I spent the next 3 days on the phone between the Israelis and Hamas. I involved the United Nations at that point and the Egyptians to try and bring out a ceasefire. By Sunday morning, we reached an agreement for a ceasefire that night at 9 o'clock. But what? Both sides refused to announce it. Without an announcement of a ceasefire, there's no ceasefire. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, I start texting friends in the Israeli media. At 5:20, my friend Ehud, who's the most respected correspondent on Arab affairs in Israel from Channel 2 News, announces that there's an agreement for a 9 o'clock ceasefire. Ehud trusted me, and he publicized that. By 7 o'clock, the entire Israeli media reported that there's a ceasefire. At 7:30, Al Jazeera in Arabic announces that there's a ceasefire for 9 o'clock. At 10 minutes after 9, 4 rockets land in Ofakim, shot by the Islamic Jihad. I received a phone call from the Prime Minister's office. Minister Miki Eitan is on the phone. He was one of the people I involved early on, a minister from the Likud. Miki says to me, Bibi wants to know if there's a ceasefire, why they're still shooting. I call up the Hamas. They're all sitting together in the office of Hania. The Prime Minister, Ahmed Jabari is there, Razi Hamad is there, the heads of the Islamic Jihad and the Popular Resistance Committees are all sitting there. Razi Hamad tells me that Ahmed Jabari is ready to send his troops out to enforce the ceasefire, but he's afraid that Israel's going to shoot at them. I call David Meidan on the phone. I tell him that message. David asked me to send it to him as a text message so that he could forward it to Benny Gantz, the Chief of Staff. 10 minutes later, I get a phone call from David Meidan, tell them to send out the troops. By 10 o'clock, a ceasefire was established. The next morning, Islamic Jihad announced that they were adhering to the ceasefire. We're entering the Jewish holidays now. On the eve of, or the evening after Yom Kippur, David, the head of Shin Bet, and his team fly to Cairo. They conduct 3 days of intensive talks. They reach an agreement. 1,027 prisoners. The first list 450 plus the 27 women. Hamas agreed that most of the VIP list would be expelled. They agreed that a large number, almost the majority, of the prisoners from the West Bank would be deported to Gaza. Those prisoners remaining in the West Bank would have to report to Palestinian Authority police stations either every day or 3 days a week, depending upon who they were. By the way, 2 weeks ago, one of them didn't report. The Palestinian Authority police notified the Israelis, and the Israelis rearrested him. The decision of the Israeli cabinet was 26-3 in favor of the deal. The Hell security establishment supported the deal. Nearly 90% of Israeli society supported the deal. I don't remember anything that 90% of Israelis supported. It was remarkable, really remarkable. The person who murdered my wife's cousin was released in the deal. I received a phone call after the government voted from Sasson's wife, Onit, after she had spoken to my wife and yelled at my wife. I came home and called her, and she yelled at me for nearly an hour. I listened to her with compassion. She said, "How could you do this? He spent less than 6 years in prison. He murdered my husband, the father of my children, with a butcher's knife. He's free now." The only thing that I could think in the back of my mind, and I didn't say it to her, I couldn't help Sasson, but Gilad's alive. October 18th, Gilad Shalit crossed the border into Israel, a free man, 5 years and 4 months in captivity. 1,027 Palestinian prisoners became free. In the first part of the deal, the 450 plus 27, 94% of them had killed Israelis. This was a tough deal with a lot of dilemmas. Not an easy deal for the public to support, and yet it supported it. I wrote a letter of thank you to Benjamin Netanyahu. He's not exactly my flavor of the month. I never voted for him. But I wrote him a letter congratulating him and thanking him because he demonstrated a rare form of leadership. It's not any genius for a leader to make the easy decisions, but when you put on the scales your values and principles of not negotiating with terrorists and not releasing prisoners, and you put on the opposite side of the scale the value of social solidarity and the principle of the unwritten covenant that we have in Israel between the people and the army, which enables us to have a people's army, and you rule in favor of those values, in my mind, you're a hero and you're a leader. I have a 20-year-old son in the army now. I have a 17-year-old son who will be in the army in a year and a half from now. As a parent living in Israel, I could not send my children to the army with ease if this deal had not gone through. And I think that's what the 90% of Israelis who supported the deal felt as well. We have been told for years that the government of Israel, the state of Israel, will do everything possible not to leave a soldier behind. I had serious doubts of whether or not that was true. In the end, it proved to be true. Gilad Shalit came home traumatic, weak. The assessment is that 2 more months in captivity he would have died. He was suffering from extreme vitamin D deficiency. For 5 years and 4 months he didn't see sunlight. If you know what happens in Scandinavia every winter, they have amongst the highest suicide rates in the world, because without vitamin D you become clinically depressed. He stopped eating his last 2 months in captivity. They tried to force feed him, they couldn't. Another 2 months, he would not have come out alive. But he's doing well now. He had surgery in his arm from his wound. He had 8 pieces of shrapnel removed that became embedded in the bone and the nerve, and he's starting physical therapy to get full use of his hands. He has it. He's healthy, he's gained weight, he has color in his skin now. I saw him a month after he was released, and he looked horrible. I was shocked. But he's doing much better today. He's thinking about his future. He'll probably go and study. He wants to study math and physics. He's doing well. Soon he'll be released from the army. He's still officially in the army, and I imagine he will go public and speak to the Israeli people and thank them for what they did on his behalf. He had a radio for 3.5 years. He heard about the campaign. He heard his parents. He heard every radio program ending with every day how long he was in underground in Gaza. He was encouraged by that, but he was discouraged also because nothing was happening. He had a television that received Arabic stations. He ate most of his meals with his captors. They had changed over the years, but there was always one person who spoke English and one person who spoke Hebrew. He did learn Arabic, but he doesn't speak it. He can understand it. He had sufficient food when he was eating. The thing that I find almost humorous is that they fed him Israeli hummus. I didn't understand that, but it turns out Israeli hummus has preservatives in it, so it has a longer shelf life. He is, I think, a symbol now for Israeli society of how far we're willing to go. One of the things that I'm always asked in these presentations and the discussions over the 5 years is, didn't we give them an incentive to kidnap more soldiers? The truth is, they don't need that incentive. They have it every day. They could kidnap a soldier every day, they could kidnap a civilian every day. In my interviews in the Arab media and in the Palestinian press, I didn't call the leaders of Hamas heroes as they presented themselves. I understood that they had a great achievement in releasing 1,047 Palestinian prisoners from jail. There are now about 6,000 Palestinians in Israeli prison today. I reminded them of the huge price that Palestinian society paid for holding an Israeli soldier. More than 3,000 Palestinians had been killed in Gaza during the 5 years and 4 months that Gilad Shalit was held there. The Gaza economy was destroyed and placed under siege. If this is a victory, then they need to do some new calculus. I think there is a recognition of that in Hamas. And some people have said we don't intend to kidnap more soldiers, others say they do. The Israeli decision, and with this I'll conclude, on releasing Gilad Shalit in the way they did in the prisoner exchange that was made, was looking forward and not looking backward. It was less important of what these people had done, and more important the risks that would be to Israeli society, because we were always being asked how many Israelis are going to have to pay with their life because these people were released. And the heads of the security establishment in Israel decided that the risks were minimal. They could be contained. The most dangerous ones were deported abroad. Those in the second category of most dangerous were sent to Gaza. During the whole Second Intifada, not one suicide bomber left Gaza. Those in the West Bank, as I said, have to report to the police stations, and there is cooperation with the Palestinian Authority police on this. So the risks are thought to be there, but minimal. I propose to the government of Israel that they announce that when we make peace with the Palestinians, Israel will release all Palestinian prisoners regardless of what they did, because that's what enemies do when they make peace. We need to begin thinking about incentives for peace and not incentives for abduction of soldiers. There is also talk in Israel, which I am definitely pushing forward, to turn this into something bigger than a prisoner exchange and to come to some kind of long-term understandings between Hamas and Israel. And there is interest in this. And fortunately now, when I pick up the Prime Minister's office, they actually know who I am and I can get to talk to people there. I did receive a letter of thanks from Prime Minister Netanyahu. I'm still waiting for the meeting with him, though. I think in conclusion, what I would like to say is that there were a lot of lessons learned for me in this, and I hope for both Israel and Hamas. The one is that when you think you can't talk, you can. You can turn a relationship of non-recognition into one where people can actually begin to trust each other. The success of this deal was because between Razi and Hamid and I, there was a trusting relationship. Not on political issues, but on issues of humanity. We were able to reach out to each other and facilitate this deal from happening. Certainly regional changes enabled it to happen, and it was done. The region is in turmoil today, and things are happening. There are opportunities out there, and as David Maidan said to me in one of our conversations in our debriefing, he said, what I learned from this experience was that it wasn't my 30 years experience as an intelligence officer, nor my experience in the field and my studies of Arabic and my knowledge of the Middle East that enabled this to happen. What I brought to the table was the ability to identify an opportunity. He gave me as a gift a copy of a book that was written by the same guy who wrote the New York Times Magazine article, Dr. Ronen Bergman. Ronen had written this book a number of years ago and then issued another revised edition of the book with the final chapter, Bringing Gilad Shalit Home. And David wrote to me a dedication of the book in which he wrote that the final chapter of this book would not have been written without you. I learned from the interview in the New York Times, they had a fact checker who called me up to check all the facts that Ronen Bergman had written, went over a 7,000-word article with me, and at the end of the discussion, the guy from the New York Times says to me, and your code name was Phoenix, right? I said, what? He said, your code name, the Israelis gave you a code name, you're the Phoenix. I said, what a great name. The bird that keeps appearing and doesn't go away. Well, that's my message to both the Israelis and the Palestinians. I'm not going away. Nader Lasser, the Egyptian intelligence officer, called me last week from Cairo and said, Gershon, when are you bringing peace? I said, Nader, I'm not going away. I'm going to do it. Thank you very much.
With that, Gershon is willing to take questions, and I want to share with you that there is no topic that he cannot handle with erudition and elegance.
But I'll try to be brief. Yeah.
Was in Gaza the whole time?
Shalit was in Gaza the whole time. He was kept mostly in 3 different locations. He was transferred from time to time in the middle of the night from one location to another, but most of the period he was in 3 locations. The last year and a half he was underneath a family, living in a basement where all the windows were boarded up. He saw cracks and he saw light, but he was in Gaza the whole time.
Do you think the Israelis knew?
No. The Israelis didn't know where he was. This is certainly one of the intelligence failures of Israel, because when you start talking to people in the intelligence community, you hear different things. It's one of the things that they're investigating to figure out how 5 years and 4 months right next door they couldn't find him. When you ask David Meidan why they couldn't find him, he says because the Shabak was in charge, the Shinbet was in charge. So he says if the Mossad was in charge, we would have found him. Yeah, in the back. Yes.
Gershon, it's good to see you again after 30 years when you listen to you. You've had such success with this. Do you think you could possibly do something with the Iranians? And what is your assessment about any?
I have friends in Iran. In fact, there was a conference a month ago in Barcelona with 2 Iranians, including one of them who claims to be a former classmate of Ahmadinejad. My answer is no. My friends in Iran won't talk to me, they're afraid. And they won't communicate by email. I will be at a conference at the beginning of April in Prague, the beginning of March in Prague, and I'm hoping there will be some Iranians there, but I think they will probably be Iranian exiles and not people from the inside. Yeah.
I don't know if it's true. I heard that Israel passed a law saying that this will no longer be allowed to have these disproportionate trades.
No, there was no law passed. There was a committee that was headed by a former Supreme Court judge, Meir Shamgar, who actually started doing the work on this issue 3 years ago, and they issued their report a couple of months ago after Shalit was freed. 100 pages of the report are secret, so I don't know what's said there. I know it was reported in the public. There was debate on whether or not Israel can set a limit on what a soldier is worth. I don't know what's in the report. What I can tell you from my experience in negotiations is that whatever's in the report is irrelevant. It'll come down to a negotiation at the end of the day, and there's no doubt that this will serve as a precedent for future cases. There's no doubt about it. So they could pass a law, which they didn't, or they could make decisions, which they might have, but I don't think it's particularly relevant. Yes?
Gershon, how much impact do you feel that the Shalit public relations campaign and the attempt in Jerusalem had in influencing Netanyahu?
I know that it deeply influenced Sarah Netanyahu. And there's no doubt in my mind that she pushed her husband to agree to the deal in the end. I think it created the situation whereby almost 90% of Israelis supported it. There almost wasn't a car or home in Israel that didn't have a bumper sticker for Gilad Shalit or a yellow ribbon from their car or on their house. So I think that the public solidarity with Gilad Shalit was there. And I'm not sure it had a great influence on the final decision-making other than influencing Sarah. The Shalits were in front of the Prime Minister's house for about a year and a half, most of the time feeling pretty much in despair. But it had an impact. It did. I don't know if it was the crucial element that did it. Yeah.
Do you think there's ever a chance that they can have a negotiated agreement in which Israel actually retains segments of the West Bank, Jerusalem, the high ground, in which case they can be a really, really good chance of peace?
Look, the framework for an Israeli-Palestinian agreement is known. There's no rocket science here. We've had 18 years of negotiations and numerous official negotiations, unofficial negotiations that have reached model agreements or near model agreements. If we look at what was achieved between Olmert and President Abbas prior to Olmert stepping down, there was a Palestinian agreement for what President Obama called an agreement based on the 1967 borders with agreed upon territorial swaps. The official position of the PLO so far has been to allow Israel to annex 1.9% of the West Bank. ALLMEP wanted 7% of the West Bank. That's a negotiation. The official Palestinian position is that they are willing to accept the formula of territorial swaps, including in Jerusalem. Even Arafat had agreed to the position of Israel retaining sovereignty over the Jewish settlements inside of Jerusalem, which we call neighborhoods. They call settlements. Ramot, Ramat Eshkol, French Hill, Gilo, Armon HaNatziv, those neighborhoods that are now part of Jerusalem where Jews live. Arafat had agreed to that. So in principle, what you're saying is there, a readiness. In my mind, if both sides were for a moment willing to believe that there was actually a partner for peace on the other side, an agreement is at hand. This is the most researched conflict in the history of conflicts. We know what the solutions are to the minutest detail on every single one of these issues. They've been all discussed, researched, and proposed. And I believe there's a majority of support in both Israel and Palestine for it. I can tell you that on the Tuesday before coming here, I had a private meeting with President Abbas, and I won't disclose everything we talked about, but I came away with that meeting and wrote a detailed report for Prime Minister Netanyahu on the readiness of President Abbas to reach an agreement with terms that Israel can more than live with. Howard.
Welcome, Gershon. Thank you.
Those of you who don't know Howard Sumka, he's the executive director of One Voice, a member organization at ALLMEP, another organization that I have the privilege to be a board member of. It's a joint Israeli-Palestinian youth organization. Howard is also the director of the USAID mission in Tel Aviv, responsible for West Bank and Gaza.
Thank you. First thing I was going to say is, why doesn't your biography say you're on the board of One Voice?
I just said.
Could you comment on how this negotiation with Hamas could affect how Israel responds to Hamas in peace negotiations, and in particular, the status of the reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah, and whether Israel will in fact continue to refuse to negotiate?
Yeah, I can't say everything that I know, but I would say that there is a different level of discourse officially and unofficially. And what you hear in the media on the official Israeli position does not necessarily reflect discussions that are taking place behind the scenes. Nonetheless, the official position of Israel is important to note because it has remained unchanged. If Hamas wants to be brought to the table, it must agree to the three conditions of the quartet, which are recognizing Israel, adhering to previous agreements, and renouncing all forms of violence. Unofficially, officially or unofficially, senior leaders in Hamas have changed their positions over time. I would say that the most important lesson that I learned about Hamas over the last 5.5 years is that virtually everything that I knew about Hamas beforehand was wrong. I was taught, I believe, that Hamas is first and foremost a religious fundamentalist Islamic movement. It is not. Hamas is first and foremost a Palestinian national movement, a political movement with an Islamic flavor. As a political movement, it's capable of change. As a religious fundamentalist movement, it is not. Hamas is going through change today. Don't misunderstand me. They are not joining the Zionist movement. They are not willing to change their basic principles or charter. But Khaled Mashal and other leaders in Hamas have said, and there's opposition to his statements, but nonetheless he's an important figure there, has said that we're talking about a Palestinian state in West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem now, and not a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. He has said that they want to join the PLO. That means implicitly accepting the agreements that the PLO made with Israel. 5 agreements were signed between Israel and the Palestinians. They were signed by the PLO, acting on behalf of the Palestinian people. Joining the PLO means that they would be required to agree to what the PLO had agreed to, so this is implicit adherence to the agreement. And Khaled Mashal has said, and others, that they are now supporting the non-violent popular resistance campaign against the occupation and no longer the armed struggle. As I said, there are challenges to Khaled Mashal's voice within the Hamas movement. Hamas is impacted by the Arab Spring, and they are about to launch internal elections for what's called Majlis al-Shura, the Shura Council. This is the senior decision-making body of Hamas. It's a secret body. that not everyone in it knows who all the other members are, and they are impacted by the call from their own people for greater accountability and for democracy within the movement. And they at some time in the next month, a couple of months, will hold some form of elections for a new Shura Council, and there's a competition of leadership there. My counterpart in Hamas, Azi Hamad, intends to run for the Shura Council. So there are changes that could happen there. I don't know exactly to what extent, but I think as changes are being made in Hamas, we're seeing some new voices on the Israeli side who are examining possibilities of one kind of understanding or another, at first at the military level on issues of ceasefire. But I can't say more than that right now.
Joel Siegel, the Global Campaign for Middle East Peace. It's an honor to be in front of Martin Luther King of Israel. That is what you are, because you're taking risks. The question I have is, in Northern Ireland, it was women and children who marched in Dublin who said they had enough of the war between Protestants and Catholics. What is your view of having an Oslo II process where Israeli academics, Israeli peace leaders like yourself, Palestinian academics, who already agree on an Arab peace plan, an Israeli peace initiative, coming to D.C., agreeing on a final status agreement, which was supposed to happen 5 years after Oslo, taking that to a referendum, going to the press, because if both sides can't reach an agreement, you're a perfect example of what happens when civil society enters the political debate, because this has got to end. This is 80 years now, but what about that idea?
Well, I would say my first initial response would be, been there, done it. We've been there, we've done it over and over again. The best example of it is the Geneva Initiative. We're a serious group of people who were negotiators in the past, representing the highest levels of Israeli and Palestinian government and military, including a former chief of staff, worked out a full, detailed agreement and hundreds of pages of annexes on every single issue: water, economics, Jerusalem, arrangements, everything. It's there. The model is there. We don't expect the government of Israel and the PLO to sign the Geneva Initiative. But believe me, when they get back to the negotiating table, they're going to open up those books and see how they resolve the problems, and this is a model. I want Benjamin Netanyahu to be the person who's going to make peace with the Palestinians. Call it the old China-Nixon thing. We need Netanyahu to be the one who's going to make peace. There is no alternative to Netanyahu in Israel to be the peacemaker. I say that as a person who will probably never vote for the man. Only he, right now, is the person who can bring along an agreement with the Palestinians that will not divide Israeli society to the point of no return. Our challenge is, how do we convince him? I don't believe that civil society is going to do it. Israeli civil society is complacent on this issue. We can get 300,000 Israelis to demonstrate about the price of cottage cheese. We can't get 5,000 of them to come out in a peace demonstration. That's just the reality of Israel today. On the Palestinian side, they have no active popular resistance. There are 7 or 8 villages that have demonstrations every Friday afternoon, and a great deal of heroes, in my mind, go out and non-violently confront the occupation and get hit with a very violent Israeli response. But this is not a popular uprising. This is happening in 7 or 8 villages involving a couple of hundred people. The Palestinian people are not out on the streets, nor are the Israeli people out on the streets. This is going to be a top-down process, not a bottom-up one. Unfortunately, the importance of the civil society organizations being supported by groups like ALLMEP, the organization that I'm the chairman of the board, and all the other organizations that I'm a member of, is that we have to keep hope alive. Israelis and Palestinians don't talk to each other. We have to convince Israelis and Palestinians that they can talk to each other, they can work to each other. This has to be the vanguard of the force which is going to be out there supporting peace when it becomes a reality.
Gershon, excuse me, only because the hour is drawing late, I'm going to suggest you take 2 more questions, and then I know you're willing to join all of us in an informal discussion at a little, or maybe after the event.
Yes, you mentioned, you were talking about Israeli civil society and how it's got to be a top-down initiative.
What do you say about the Israeli Peace Initiative, which is a civil society, business, high-tech people?
Yeah, I'm part of that, and of course I support it. And Kobe Hoover is a very good friend, and Val Robin is a friend, and I think it's a nice document and all, but it's completely irrelevant. Unfortunately, the reality is in 2002, the Arab League, representing 22 Arab countries, issued the document that has been ratified 5 times since by the Arab League. It still is the official position of the Arab League. We are trying to do everything that we can to make sure that at an upcoming Arab League summit they won't withdraw it, because the message of withdrawing is absolutely horrible. This is an official document representing Arab countries. We have nothing parallel from an Israeli Peace Initiative. A civil society initiative of a peace declaration by business people, by academics, I'm one of them, with all due respect, is not going to change the world. It's another piece of paper. It has to be, if tomorrow the government of Israel would say, we support the Israeli Peace Initiative as a response to the Arab Peace Initiative, then we have a major breakthrough. And that's why it's important to try and show the Israeli government that there are alternatives. Yes?
Thank you. Besides being honored to hear this little piece of history and your place in it, it was interesting. I didn't hear one thing about any Americans or the United States being involved in any way, which is fine. But bringing it home, I heard, maintain hope, convince Netanyahu, and continue to do what we're doing. But is there any other way that we can really, besides giving money and doing this?
Can you move up the clock on elections? Move up the clock on elections, make them tomorrow?
Honestly, because I never thought I would see peace in the region in my lifetime. And I think if there's not peace in the Middle East, there will never be peace anywhere else in the world. So this is the most important thing in the world.
That's a really good segue for my final words. This conflict is resolvable. Don't anyone believe that it's not. This is a conflict of 2 people who have been struggling over a piece of land. The solution to the conflict is known. It's a territorial conflict, and the solution is territorial. Partitioning the land into 2 states for 2 people. This is what the international community has proposed since 1937. It is still relevant, and it remains the only solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, if solution means end of conflict. If you want all kinds of other options that will deepen the conflict and make the violence more acute, then talk about 1 state or any other possibility. 2 states for 2 people is the solution. We know how to do it. We know what the maps look like. We know what Jerusalem will look like. We know what the economic relations are. We know how to deal with water. There is not a single issue that we don't know how to resolve. Every single one, including all the serious security dimensions to it. In my conversation with Mahmoud Abbas 2 weeks ago, I suggested to him that if you want to get Israeli concessions on territory, which is the most important thing to you, then you have to take more seriously Israel's strategic threat perceptions with regard to its security. It's not made up. It's real. And there are real solutions for it. We have to mitigate the Palestinians' need for real sovereignty and Israel's need for real security, and there are solutions for doing that. If we crack that nut, I believe everything else falls into place. We have to convince the Israeli and Palestinian public that there is a partner for peace on the other side, and there is a partner for peace on both sides, even with Hamas. Because at the end of the day, if we reach an agreement where the Palestinian state will be established in most of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the agreement will say that it will be implemented in Gaza when there's a regime there ready to accept the terms of the agreement. And as President Abbas said to me, let us deal with Hamas, there are problems. Give me an agreement that I can sell to my people, and Hamas will not be an obstacle, and he's 100% right. This is doable. What we need from you people is to send that message to Washington and to send that message to the people who are friends of Israel or claim to be the friends of Israel. To tell Netanyahu that he needs to demonstrate his leadership once again. He needs to make history and not become history. And we need him to do that. And if you're a friend of Israel and you're a friend of Netanyahu, that's the message he has to get. We'll deliver the message to the Palestinian side of what they need to compromise on. We need your help with the Israeli side. Thank you very much. Take a pile.